inequality in the U.S. does appear to be rising over the past several decades. Let's look at some evidence of rising income inequality. You can also find evidence of rising inequality of wealth as well. Particularly at the top end of the income distribution, we're seeing, well, a lot of the rich getting richer. It isn't necessarily that the poor are getting poorer, but clearly upper income people have been bringing in more and more income, both in absolute and in relative terms, taking a larger slice of the economic pie over time. Now, I'm just going to show you a couple little pieces of evidence to support that point. Here we have data from 1970 to 2008. Here we're showing something called a Gini index, which is an economic measure of inequality. At 0, the Gini index would suggest perfect equality, everyone having equal incomes. At 1, they would have perfect inequality. One person would have all income and nobody else would have anything. Of course, in the real world, you never really get to 1. But you can see that this measure of inequality, this Gini index, appears to be rising over time, steadily rising over time, suggesting that income is becoming more and more unequally distributed. This figure is a little easier to read. We're looking at the share of income held by different groups. You'll notice that the top 5% appears to be taking home a larger and larger slice of the income pie, a bigger share of all income earned going to the top 5%. On the other hand, the relative share going to the bottom 40% has been declining. Here's another figure that makes a similar point, but it's broken down by more groups. Those in the bottom fifth have only seen their income go up by about 16%. The middle fifth, by about 25%, an increase from 1979 to 2007. The highest fifth, the top quintile, now they've seen a lot bigger increase in their incomes, a 95% increase in their incomes, and then finally, the top 1%. Well, according to this Congressional Budget Office study, they're estimating that from 1979 to 2007, a whopping 271% increase in the share in after-tax incomes since 1979. A really massive increase. The farther one reaches up into the income distribution, the faster the rate of growth in income one finds. The incomes of the top 1% appear to be rapidly pulling away from those in the other 99%, but the growth in their income pales in comparison to that for, say, the top 1/100th of 1% of income earners. To put it another way, a substantial amount of the growth of inequality at the top is the hyper-rich moving faster and faster ahead of everyone else, including the merely rich. In this sense, it might make more sense for anti-inequality protesters to call themselves the 99.9% or the 99.99%, rather than the 99% in reference to those who are supposedly getting rich at everyone else's expense. To make that point, a couple quick graphs. Here we're looking at much longer term data from 1913 to 2003. The numbers here are showing the top 5%, excuse me, anywhere from the top 10% all the way up to the top 5%. Look at more recent trends, a slight upward trend. Here we're looking at the people who are in the top 5%, but not quite in the top 1%. People are doing very well, but not right at the top. There you can see a little faster increase in recent decades, but still, it's not that, the growth rate doesn't appear to be that fast. But then you look at the top 1%, well, their share dropped for decades. Back in the 1930s and 40s, it dropped, and by the time you get into the early 70s, it kind of hits a kind of a low point. But then since the mid to late 70s, you see the share of income going to the top 1% rising very dramatically. In other words, the very high income earners are pulling faster and faster away from people who just have just a little less income. And that becomes obvious when we look at shares of total income to the top 1/10 of 1% and the top 100th of 1% from 1945 onward. And you can see that for a long time, they were fairly stable. There was actually a little bit of a downward trend with the top 1/100th of 1% up until the mid-70s. But then, since the mid-70s, both of these very high income groups have seen accelerating growth in terms of their share of total income. Again, pointing out that, well, the rich are getting richer, and those who are the richest of all are, well, pulling away fastest of all. Now, let's turn our interest very quickly, very shortly, to the geography of inequality. Now, ideally, we'd have a chart up here that would be color-coded, a little easier to read, but you can still get the general idea just glancing at this chart. Darker colored spots on this little U.S. map are showing areas that have lower levels of inequality. On the other hand, when we look at the lightest colors, we're looking at areas that tend to have higher levels of inequality. Again, don't worry about the details. What we need to look at here is simply how income inequality, in this case measured by Gini coefficients, how they're, well, distributed very unequally geographically. There's little blotches of areas where inequality is low and other areas where inequality is quite a bit high. And basically inequality is local. It is determined by where you live, and some areas have a lot more inequality than others. Here we're looking at where high income earners live. The darker the colors, in this case, the more concentration of high income earners. And here's a short list of some of the top counties in the United States in terms of high-income households. Again, we're not worried about the details. We just want to point out that there's little patches here, there, and wherever, a lot of times in large cities, along the coast, and in some other areas as well, where you tend to have communities that are very, very, very wealthy. On the other hand, you have a lot of other parts of the country where you have very few high-income earners in relative terms. So, the rich, or at least high-income earners, are distributed quite unevenly across the country. And you know what? The same kind of point applies to poverty as well. Poverty is distributed very, very unequally across the United States. The darker colors in this particular map are showing high poverty areas. And you can see along some parts of the southeast United States, the American South, and the Southwest, you have a lot of areas that have a lot of poverty, and some areas, just to give one example, along the southern Texas border, you're looking at some areas there, some areas in New Mexico, a few blotches in the American South that have really intensely high concentrations of poor people living in them. So once again, poverty is distributed unequally across the country. Once again, where you live will determine how many high-income earners there are, how many poor people there are, and how much inequality there is. Whoop. Let's try this one more time. Changing subjects. Around the world, inequality in urban areas is rising, and social mobility appears to be slowing down in large cities across the globe. Now, that's unfortunate because, frankly, cities have been a place for a long time where people with less skills, poor people, people looking to improve their lives can move from rural areas and smaller towns, smaller cities, to bigger cities and basically achieve more success and gain more upward social mobility. It appears like that's becoming more difficult for more people in more places across the world. That's not just outside the United States, it's definitely happening inside the United States as well. Compared to other industrialized nations, the U.S. has relatively high levels of inequality of both income and wealth.